Environmental groups recently held a rally calling for state legislators to speed up the transition to the use of renewable energy. This follows other recent efforts directed at the state and the city amid growing concerns about the challenge posed by climate change. To bring us up to date is a representative from one of the groups, 350 Massachusetts. We'd like to welcome its legislative manager, Andrew Gordon. Thank you very much for being with us, Andrew.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
The big goal here is all renewable by 2050 in a state like Massachusetts. This is just one state. So in the global picture, why is meeting that goal so important?
So I think it's not just one state. You have a bunch of other states that are showing leadership on this. And I think this is what's really interesting, that our elected leadership on Beacon Hill like to say, hey, we're continuing our world-class leadership on climate change, when that's not what they're doing. New York, California, Vermont, New Jersey are all accelerating renewable energy growth on a much faster timetable. The reason why it's so important in the global context is that the United States is a massive source of emissions, but right now we have a government and an EPA that is not interested in growing renewable energy, no matter how many jobs it creates in the United States, and they're actively hostile to the industry, as we saw with the solar tariffs proposed by the Trump administration, I believe last year. So for us and for other states, this is a chance to show scalable leadership. So when Massachusetts or New York or California does something, we're offering policy models that other states, like my home state of Ohio, where I'm originally from, or Illinois can pick up and run with and tackle the problem from a state level.
Well, the route to renewable energy, a lot of that's about utility laws and regulations. So what are you pursuing here?
So what we're pursuing really is a pretty common sense proposal. What we have in this state is called a renewable portfolio standard. What that is the amount of energy that the utility companies have to buy from clean renewable sources built after 1997, the best of the best. Your solar, your wind, geothermal, those kinds of sources that are low on emissions and can be sited in Massachusetts. That amount, that percentage that the utilities have to buy, goes up by 1% every single year. That would get us to 100% renewable by 2105, which seems ridiculous. My grandkids would still be pushing for the policy and waiting by then. So we would like, at the very least, to have that number triple. So rather than go up by 1%, go up by 3% every single year. That gets Massachusetts to 100% renewable roughly by 2050. It gets us to 50% renewable by 2030. The problem here that's being pushed back, or at least in legislator pushback, has been, oh, well, we can get to 50% renewable by 2030, no problem. The problem is that they are counting sources that do not qualify as clean. They're counting Canadian hydroelectric. They're counting old Class 2 renewables that don't meet the same standards. They're counting an alternative portfolio standard that also does not measure up. So really, Beacon Hill is looking for a way out when we are simply trying to hold them accountable to do the right thing.
Are there enough of those clean energy sources to meet the goal, though?
Yes. So the great thing about the RPS is that it actually sets demand for the market. So if you think about the RPS as the giant bat signal calling renewable companies to come in and invest, we actually, because of 2 years ago when we did the massive offshore wind procurement with the act to promote clean energy that Rep. Haddad sponsored, actually unbalanced our supply and demand portfolio from that perspective. So if we did nothing to increase demand, we'd actually undercut the renewable market because we'd be having so much offshore wind supply come on in the 2030s. This is to ensure that we continue to get more and more supply come online.
Now, I know it's one thing to mandate demand for clean energy sources, but on the other hand, is that as cheap as what we've been doing so far with fossil fuels?
It's actually incredibly cheap. The really interesting thing is that the utilities and the big business lobby will talk a lot about big price increases. One, we don't pay the most expensive bills in the country. We're actually much closer to the center. Two, to do a 3% RPS increase, you know how much your bill would go up per month?
Tell me.
$2. That's, for me, as someone who goes to Dunkin' Donuts every day, it's the equivalent of going from a large black iced coffee to a medium or a small twice a month.
No, I'm a small user, of course, just a Boston resident. But on the other hand, if you're talking about businesses, they're looking at places to locate. Couldn't that add to maybe a disincentive for them to come here?
Not necessarily. I think because you're creating so many additional jobs and the wholesale price of electricity is coming down. So if you do a 3% RPS, you're looking at an 8.1% drop in the price of wholesale electricity. You're also not having to worry about grid stability as much because we have such an overdependence on natural gas right now that you're having to worry less about peak hours because we're incentivizing storage, we're incentivizing electric vehicle use, all things that end up reducing price long term.
Well, what about gas? Because I keep hearing that we have more of it now, even domestically produced, and at the same time, there's this concern about what about the future? What about pipelines that people want to add on?
So the big concern for us is that pipelines, because the price of developing renewables is coming crashing down so quickly, that the only way that a pipeline can be financed by a company right now is if they can essentially foot ratepayers with the bill. It's what we've been fighting for 2 years, which is called a pipeline tax. 2 years ago, the Supreme Judicial Court said that's not a legal way to structure the Department of Utilities gas buying agreement, and the utilities and the gas companies are trying to change that. So because we don't want to get stuck with the bill, both from a ratepayer perspective, from an environmental justice perspective, we've been fighting to ensure that language stays the same in the general code so that that does not happen. It's the equivalent, and I actually think, I forget who came out with this recently, but one of the experts in analyzing gas, essentially nationally and regionally, said that the New England pipeline supply is efficient for all of 12 days out of the year. So good for every day of the year except maybe 12 at worst, which lines up with what the Attorney General's been saying for 2+ years.
Now, on the other hand, not so long ago, at least, we were bringing in gas on ships from places like Russia. I mean, why would we be doing that if we have enough in the pipeline?
So the reason, so what we do to supplement the gas when there's supposed peaks or not enough, we do additional LNG, which is fine. We do some additional, though. I'm trying to think, I don't think we do as much coal as we used to. Actually, I know we don't. But the point is, there's cheaper ways to handle this. Rather than build a $5 billion pipeline and stick it on the backs of ratepayers and in communities across the state that do not want it. I'm sure you probably remember the West Roxbury pipeline fight of a few years ago. Picture that spread out across the state. Rather than do it that way, while we continue to ramp up renewables, we can bring on cheaper options like LNG when we have to.
We're talking with Andrew Gordon from 350 Massachusetts here on BNN News. Andrew, another thing that you're pushing up in the legislature is, I guess, a bill that was sort of set out an environmental justice criteria. What would that be exactly like?
So the important thing to understand here is that the environmental justice statutes that we operate under right now are the result of an executive order by Governor Patrick an administration ago. We just want to see that codified into law by the state legislature. So it's not operating under the whim of the executive. The important thing to understand is that so many of our at-risk communities do not have the same kind of protections regarding siting of additional energy infrastructure or even just planning considerations that they should be afforded as we try and make an equitable, just transition. So we're trying to ensure that state agencies and the legislature have to abide by the same considerations that we would hope that these communities should be afforded.
Now, we've heard for a long time that the effects of greenhouse gases include everything from sea levels rising to respiratory problems. Mm-hmm. How does that play out here in Boston's neighborhoods?
So think about it this way. You know what the single, or if not the single biggest, one of the single biggest components of the state budget is?
I imagine healthcare.
Mass health. So think about every dollar that we invest to work with childhood asthma and those kinds of respiratory diseases, right? We're doing great things at Boston Children's Hospital. Every single time that we don't address gas leaks, every single time that we don't do anything to address infrastructure concerns, we are undermining those dollars. We're making it more expensive to treat the very thing that we're trying to counteract in the first place. That's how that's one of the ways they play out. Also, the pipeline fight that's happening in the Back Bay neighborhoods currently is something to pay attention to. But this is such an intersectional issue. because it is not just trees, it's people, right? I don't do this because I want to hug a tree. I do this because I care about people. I do this because I care about my community. That's why all of us in the climate movement push forward. So it's because we want to offer a just and equitable future.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Andy Gordon from 350 Massachusetts. In a moment, adopting a highway in Dorchester. We'll tell you about a cleanup effort by the Phi Beta Sigma fraternity.